Nails. Most Christians picture Jesus on the cross with nails through his palms. Every painting, every crucifix, every Easter play for the last 2,000 years shows it that way. Here's the thing though, that's probably not how it actually happened. Medical evidence and historical crucifixion studies tell us the nails most likely went through the wrists, specifically through the carpal bones, because your palms literally cannot support your body weight. The tissue would just rip straight through. It's basic anatomy. The Romans knew what they were doing. They'd been crucifying people for a long time, and they figured out what worked. Think about it from their perspective. Crucifixion wasn't just execution. It was a carefully designed torture method meant to maximize suffering and serve as public warning. The Romans were engineers and military strategists. They didn't mess around with methods that didn't work. Archaeological evidence actually backs this up. In 1968, archaeologists found the remains of a crucified man near Jerusalem. The nail was still in the heel bone, showing exactly how they did it. His wrists showed similar trauma patterns. So every artistic depiction you've ever seen is anatomically incorrect. Does this change the meaning of the sacrifice? Absolutely not. Does it change what Jesus went through? Not at all. But it's wild that we've been visualizing it wrong this whole time. The wrist placement makes way more sense when you think about it. The bones there can actually hold weight. Carpenter. So here's another thing art and tradition got completely wrong. Before his ministry, the Bible literally calls Jesus a carpenter, so most people imagine him in a small workshop making tables and chairs. Here's the actual deal. The Greek word used in the Bible is tekton, and it doesn't mean carpenter like we think of it today. It means builder or craftsman, someone who worked with both wood and stone in construction. Think general contractor or construction worker, not furniture maker. Jesus was probably on building sites helping construct houses and structures. He worked with timber for sure, but probably with stone too. He was doing manual labor in the ancient construction industry. In 1st century Galilee, construction was booming under Herod Antipas. Cities like Sepphoris were being rebuilt just a few miles from Nazareth. Jesus and Joseph likely traveled to these sites regularly for work. It wasn't romantic. It was hard. Physical labor in the heat. Carrying heavy materials, shaping rough stone, sweating in the sun alongside other workers. So saying carpenter isn't exactly wrong. It's an approximate translation, because he did work with wood. Jesus wasn't running a quiet workshop making dining room sets. He was probably dusty and exhausted from hauling materials and building actual buildings. He wasn't an artisan craftsman. He was a working class builder, which honestly makes some of his parables make more sense. When he talks about building houses on rock versus sand, he's speaking from actual experience. When he mentions beams and planks, he knows that world. It's just not the gentle woodworker image we've all been fed. The Last Supper. One painting literally rewrote everyone's understanding of history. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper is so iconic, so burned into culture, that it's shaped how every single person pictures that night. Long table, everyone sitting on one side facing out, modern chairs, formal setup. Here's the reality. 1st century Jewish meals looked nothing like that. People reclined on cushions around a low table, kind of leaning on their sides. No chairs, no formal straight line of people. This is why the Bible mentions John reclining on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. That sounds weird if you picture Da Vinci's painting, but makes total sense with actual meal customs. Everyone was sort of leaning and lounging around this low table. It was intimate and informal. They would have been close enough to share food from common dishes, leaning on their left sides and eating with their right hands. The whole setup encouraged conversation and closeness. But Da Vinci painted it Renaissance style because that's what made sense to his audience. He wanted every face visible. He made artistic choices that worked brilliantly for a painting, but bore no resemblance to historical reality. And now that image is what most thinks happened. One painting from the 1500s has convinced billions of people across 5 centuries that they know what the Last Supper looked like. The next time you see that painting, try to imagine the actual scene. Middle Eastern guys in robes reclining around a low table, eating with their hands in a much more casual setup. The cross. So you know how we say Jesus carried his cross to Golgotha? Here's what most people don't realize. The Romans didn't use just one standard cross design. They had different types. Sometimes it was a T shape, sometimes an X shape, sometimes just a vertical pole. And here's the interesting part. Often, the vertical post was already there at the execution site, sometimes even a permanent upright beam. And in some cases, it could literally be a tree or a solid wooden trunk fixed in the ground. The condemned person usually carried only the horizontal beam, called the patibulum. This actually explains a ton. How could Jesus, after being tortured and beaten, carry an entire heavy wooden cross through Jerusalem? It always seemed physically impossible. A full cross could weigh well over 200 pounds, but a crossbeam alone would be maybe 75 to 125 pounds. Still incredibly heavy and brutal, especially carried on lacerated shoulders, but physically possible. The patibulum would be tied across the shoulders behind the neck, forcing the condemned to walk with arms spread. It was designed to be humiliating and painful, even before reaching the execution site. This also explains why Simon of Cyrene was pressed into service to carry it part way. Jesus wasn't weak. He'd been whipped, beaten, and was likely in shock. Carrying even the crossbeam was too much. The Romans wanted him alive for the crucifixion, so they grabbed someone from the crowd to help. This also connects to some interesting theology. In Christian tradition, the cross gets linked to the tree of life from Genesis. When you understand that the vertical part was already standing and permanent, that symbolism gets even deeper. The tree was already there, planted. Jesus brought the crossbeam to complete it. I'm not saying that's what the Romans were thinking. They were just efficient executioners. But the symbolism works out in fascinating ways. So when we say Jesus carried his cross, technically he carried half a cross, which honestly makes the whole thing more believable as a historical event, while keeping all the theological weight. 12 disciples. Quick clarification that matters more than you'd think. Jesus didn't have just 12 disciples total. He had tons of disciples. The word just means followers or students. The 12 were specifically the apostles, his inner circle of leaders, but lots of other people followed Jesus and learned from him. The Bible mentions women disciples by name: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and others. They traveled with Jesus and supported his ministry. Luke's gospel specifically mentions that these women provided for Jesus and the disciples out of their own resources, meaning they had financial means and chose to support the movement. Mary Magdalene, in particular, gets a bad reputation in tradition as a prostitute, but the Bible never says this. That's completely made up. She was actually one of the most faithful disciples, present at the crucifixion when most of the men fled, and she was the first witness to the resurrection. That's huge. In a culture where women's testimony wasn't even considered legally valid, Jesus appeared first to a woman and made her the first evangelist. There were probably dozens or even hundreds of people who considered themselves disciples at various points. The 12 had special significance as leaders and witnesses, sure, but acting like they were the only followers is just wrong. It's like saying a teacher only has 12 students because 12 sit in the front row. Everyone else in the class still counts. This matters because it shows how much broader Jesus's movement was. It wasn't just a tiny group of guys wandering around. It was a whole community of people. Women were part of it from the beginning. Disciples came and went. Some stuck around, some didn't. The movement was bigger and more dynamic than we usually picture. Jesus sent out 72 disciples at one point on a mission trip. That's way more than 12. The early church had this rich diversity of followers from the very start. Jesus was soft. Okay, so Sunday school teaches gentle Jesus, meek and mild, right? Soft-spoken, never raises his voice, turns the other cheek, loves everyone equally. Here's the thing, that's only half the picture. Jesus absolutely showed love and compassion, no question, but he also showed righteous anger when it was needed. The temple incident is the obvious example. He didn't politely ask the money changers to leave. He braided a whip, flipped their tables, scattered their coins, and drove them out. This was not calm Jesus. This was furious Jesus. Think about what this scene actually looked like. Jesus took the time to sit down and braid a whip from cords. That's not a moment of lost temper. That's deliberate, building anger. Then he physically overturned heavy tables of money, released animals, and used the whip to drive people out. There would have been chaos, shouting, coins rolling everywhere, animals stampeding. This wasn't symbolic or metaphorical. This was real disruption. He shut down the whole operation. He called the religious leaders snakes and vipers to their faces. He called them whitewashed tombs, basically saying they looked good outside but were full of death inside. That's harsh. In Matthew's gospel, he delivers an entire chapter of woes against the Pharisees, calling them hypocrites 7 times in a row. He told people to hate their families compared to following him. He spoke difficult truths that made people uncomfortable and angry. He challenged power constantly. differently. He also wasn't afraid of controversy. He touched lepers when that made you ritually unclean. He talked to Samaritan women in public, breaking multiple social taboos at once. He hung out with tax collectors and sinners, earning the criticism that he was a glutton and drunkard. He healed on the Sabbath even though he knew it would enrage the religious authorities. He did it anyway. So this image of Jesus as always gentle and soft, it's incomplete. Jesus knew when to be tender and when to be confrontational, when to comfort and when to challenge. His anger wasn't random or petty. It was directed at hypocrisy and injustice, but it was still real anger, real intensity. The meek and mild thing comes from centuries of art and children's Bibles softening him down. Real Jesus was way more intense. Jesus' birthday. Nobody knows when Jesus was actually born. We genuinely have no idea of the actual date. December 25th was chosen by the church centuries later for symbolic and calendar reasons. It had nothing to do with historical evidence. Here's what makes it even wilder. Jesus was probably born before the year 0, before Christ. How is that possible? Calendar miscalculation. When they set up the Anno Domini dating system way later, they got the math wrong. The monk who created our calendar system, Dionysius Exiguus, was working in the 6th century trying to calculate backward to Jesus' birth. He didn't have great records and made several errors in his calculations. Most scholars think Jesus was born somewhere between 6 BC and 4 BC based on historical records about Herod and other events mentioned in the Gospels. So Christ was born before Christ. Let that sink in for a second. As for December 25th, the church likely chose it because it aligned with existing winter solstice festivals. Roman Saturnalia, Sol Invictus, other pagan celebrations. It was strategic. Pick a date people already celebrate and Christianize it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually pretty smart. The first recorded celebration of Christmas on December 25th was in Rome in 336 AD, 3 centuries after Jesus died. Before that, Christians didn't celebrate his birth at all. They focused on Easter and his resurrection. But it means Christmas has zero connection to Jesus' actual birthday. Some scholars think he was born in spring or summer, based on details about shepherds being in the fields. In Judea, shepherds didn't keep their flocks outside overnight in December because it was too cold. Spring lambing season makes more sense. Other scholars point to the census mentioned in Luke, trying to figure out when Rome would have conducted one. But honestly, we just don't know. Understanding that the tradition and the history are different doesn't make Christmas less meaningful. It just means we should be honest about what we actually know versus what we've decided to celebrate. Jesus' looks. As a first-century Galilean Jew, Jesus almost certainly had olive skin, dark brown or black hair, and Middle Eastern facial features. This shouldn't be controversial, but somehow it is. Renaissance artists painted Jesus looking European because that's what they knew. Blonde hair, blue eyes, pale skin, basically Italian or Northern European. And that image spread everywhere through colonialism and missions. Every culture throughout history has painted Jesus to look like themselves, which actually shows something beautiful about his universal appeal. Ethiopian Christians paint him with African features. Asian Christians paint him with Asian features. There's something profound about people seeing Christ reflected in their own image. But historically, he was a Middle Eastern man. When you see those forensic reconstructions based on first-century Jewish skulls from the region, they look nothing like traditional Jesus paintings. They look like modern Middle Eastern men, which makes total sense. He probably had short hair too, not the long flowing locks in every painting. Jewish men in that era typically kept their hair relatively short. Long hair on men was actually associated with Nazirite vows, which Jesus didn't take. The long hair image comes from later artistic tradition, probably influenced by Greek and Roman gods who were depicted with flowing hair to show their divine status. This matters more than just getting the details right. The white European Jesus image has been used to justify a lot of harm. It made Christianity seem like a white Western religion when it started in the Middle East. It erased the actual ethnic and cultural context. It was used during colonialism to suggest that Jesus looked like the colonizers, which gave a false sense of divine approval to conquest and oppression. So yeah, Jesus wasn't white. He was brown. He looked like his neighbors in Galilee, and that's important to remember. 3 wise men. Here's something that might blow your mind. The Bible never says there were 3 wise men, not once. Matthew's gospel mentions magi from the east, but doesn't give a number. We assumed 3 because the text mentions 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But there could have been 2 magi, or 5, or a dozen. We literally have no idea. The tradition of 3 wise men with names, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, developed centuries later. Those names don't appear anywhere in scripture. They're from medieval Christian tradition, probably developed to make the story more concrete and memorable. Different Christian traditions actually have different names for them. The number 3 stuck because of the 3 gifts, and it made for better art and nativity scenes to have a specific count. Also, these weren't kings. That's another later addition to the story. They were magi, probably astronomers or astrologers from Persia or Arabia. They studied the stars and interpreted celestial events. In the ancient world, astronomy and astrology weren't separate disciplines like they are now. These were educated, wealthy men who made a dangerous journey based on what they saw in the sky. They brought expensive gifts, which is why people assumed they were royalty, but the text just calls them magi. And those gifts? They weren't random. Gold represented kingship. Frankincense represented divinity and priesthood. It was used in temple worship. Myrrh represented death and suffering. It was used in burial preparations. So even the gifts were prophetic about who Jesus was and what would happen to him. The Magi probably had no idea how loaded their gift choices were, but in hindsight, they were incredibly significant. The other detail everyone gets wrong is the timing. Those nativity scenes with the Magi at the manger never happened. By the time the Magi arrived, Jesus was probably a toddler, maybe up to 2 years old. Matthew says they came to a house, not a stable. Herod, trying to kill Jesus based on the Magi's timeline, ordered all boys 2 years and under killed. That suggests Jesus could have been walking and talking by the time these visitors showed up. The journey from the east would have taken months or even longer, so the wise men weren't at the birth. They came later, possibly much later. No emotions. Last thing, and it's actually the most important theologically, some Christians act like Jesus didn't really have emotions, or his emotions weren't fully human. Like he was going through the motions, but not really feeling it the same way we do. The Bible completely contradicts this. Jesus wept at Lazarus' death. That's the shortest verse in the Bible, but it carries huge meaning. He cried. Real tears, real grief. In Gethsemane, before his arrest, he felt such anguish that he sweat drops of blood. That's a real medical condition called hematidrosis that happens under extreme stress. He felt fear. He felt dread. He asked if there was any other way. He got angry at hypocrisy and injustice. He felt love for his friends and compassion for crowds. He experienced the full range of human emotion. This isn't a weakness in Jesus. It's theologically essential. If he wasn't fully human, experiencing real human emotions and struggles, then his sacrifice doesn't mean the same thing. If he just pretended to feel pain and fear and grief, then what did he really overcome? The whole point is that he was tempted in every way we are, suffered what we suffer, felt what we feel, and still remained sinless. That's what makes it meaningful. Understanding who Jesus really was, fully human and fully divine, makes the story even more powerful. He didn't float through life above human experience, he dove into it completely.